Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, the 9th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2013. And can I start by asking everyone to switch off any electronic devices, telephones, etc. that they have. And we go then to agenda item 1, which is the Department for Work and Pensions, who are here, the officials from that department. And we have Richard Cornish, the Work Services Director for Scotland, Pete Serrell, the Strategy Director, Jason Feeney, the Benefits Director, and Bill Gunyon, the Chief Medical Advisor and Director for Health and Wellbeing. I'd like to invite officials from the Department for Work and Pensions to make a short statement, and I understand that Pete Serrell is going to do that on your behalf. But before we start, Mr Serrell, and this is no reflection at all on the officials who are before us this morning, but I would just like to put on record, because I know that this does reflect the views of the committee, that we had hoped this morning as part of our evidence to meet with decision makers from the Department of Work and Pensions. Now we know and we understand that because of the level at which they are employed, that it would be difficult for them to comment on the record. So we had tried to facilitate an off-the-record briefing which would have been beneficial to members of the committee. The ministers responsible for those officials denied us the opportunity to have that briefing. That's a disappointment, to say the least, because what we're trying to do in this committee is get the best possible picture and understanding of what's happening in the process as the welfare reform changes are working through. We understood the difficulties in having ATOS officials here speaking to us on the record, but in practical terms, when we went out to an ATOS facility, it meant that the whole committee couldn't attend. We had to send a delegation, and feedback information which those who were on the delegation benefited from, but could only convey second-hand to the committee members who were unable to participate in that delegation. If we take up the offer that's been given to us to go to a DWP facility to talk to decision makers there, we would have to have the same arrangement. We couldn't take the whole committee, and therefore we're in the same situation that rather than have 2 or 3 officials from the DWP informing all of the committee, 2 or 3 members of our committee will have to go to a DWP facility and then feed back to the remainder of the committee and try and appraise our colleagues of the information that becomes available. In a practical sense, that just is not as satisfactory as it would have been had we been given the opportunity to talk to the decision makers directly. I think that reflects very badly on the ministers who appear, for whatever reason, not to want to cooperate with this committee. We're trying our best to get an understanding of the situation. That's why the officials are here this morning. So I just would like, on behalf of our committee, to send out a message to Ian Duncan-Smith and Lord Freud that the way that they are treating this committee is not doing them any good in the eyes of those who are being affected by changes in welfare system. And it is not, I think, indicative of a degree of cooperation between ourselves and the government at Westminster, and I just want to send that message out this morning on behalf of the committee. So that's no reflection on those who have come this morning. Thanks very much for taking the time to come and speak to us, and I'll hand over to you, Mr Serrell, to make your statement.
Thanks. Could briefly respond to that point. I understand your points. It's even though it would be off the record, it's still a very formal setting, and we're talking about extremely junior members of staff here. So. In civil service terms, just EOs. Jason is the benefits director who's in charge of all decision making in the department, so he'll be able to talk about the work that they do. We could facilitate a visit this week if it suits you. Very, very happy, very keen that you should hear from decision makers. We think it's best to see what they have, what they do, hear what they have to say in context, so you can actually look at them dealing with cases, talk through those sort of cases. I'm sure those members who were able to go to the ATOS office found that visit very useful. So if the committee wanted, we could facilitate something this week, next week, as soon as you like. But I kind of note your concerns.
Well, I think we had indicated that we would take that offer up because it's the only offer that was on the table, so we will try and facilitate that as soon as possible. I appreciate that, Mr Serrell. Thank you.
Just briefly by way of introduction, the government's introducing a huge programme of reform. I just want to outline some of the objectives of those reforms because it's crucial to see them in the context of those objectives. First and foremost, the reforms are designed to make work pay. Too much about the current system, the system that the government inherited, actually disincentivises work. So the government aims to make work pay through a whole series of reforms. Secondly, it's to focus support on those who need it most, but also to enhance personal responsibility, personal capability, and to address dependency. So a number of the specific measures and elements of the reforms such as universal credit are designed to help people help themselves out of poverty. Just as important, of course, the system needs to be affordable and sustainable. The government inherited a very large deficit, a very large debt, and needed to get the fiscal position back in line. So a number of reforms were needed to make the system affordable. Those aren't reducing the overall cost of the system. They are, in fact, just maintaining, controlling the increase in the growth in costs over time. The government also is keen to localise provision where it makes sense to do so. So the introduction of local council tax support and the local welfare fund are both aimed to take decision-making and support down to the local level where the government feels it's appropriate in the case of those particular measures. The government's also determined to simplify an extremely complicated system, and partly through doing that to modernise and greatly improve service delivery for claimants. It's a very big few weeks we've had in the department and across the country with the implementation of these reforms. A number of the most important reforms were introduced in April. So universal credit went live as a pathfinder in the northwest of England. PIP, the personal independence payment, has also gone live in a number of areas of England. Benefit cap went live in 4 London boroughs and will be rolled out further from July. The localisation of council tax and the welfare fund, again, introduced in April. And the spare room subsidy started again at the start of April. So a whole series of major reforms have just kicked off. The government's approach is to introduce those so that we can land them safely, where necessary to introduce them gradually and to expand fairly gradually. So, for example, universal credit is starting very small with new claims from unemployed people, and we'll expand it only when we feel it's safe to do so. Also, as part of that, determined to work in partnership with all other social sector and third sector and local government administrations to make sure that the impacts of the reforms are as positive as they can be. And lastly, to monitor and evaluate the reforms on an ongoing basis so we really understand how they're working and make sure that we can implement them effectively. Lastly, from me, when Ian Duncan Smith appeared informally before the committee at the end of March, he asked me to visit a number of local authorities, in particular to look at rural local authorities and the impact there. I've been doing that over the last few weeks, and I just want to thank all of the local authorities I've spoken to and the housing associations for very constructive discussions. They won't always and didn't always agree with the government's policies, but they were always very open and honest and straight in explaining the challenges that they face in doing so. So thank you to them. And David Mundell, the Scotland Office Minister, is also conducting a series of visits to local authorities. He's most of the way through now. And again, very constructive, positive conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr. Sell. I'll open up to members of the committee, but just to get an idea of just the basis on which the success or otherwise of the reforms are operating. Not so long ago, the UK Statistics Authority gave the Cabinet Secretary a reprimand for misusing information to the effect that he claimed that already 8,000 people have moved into jobs who would otherwise have been on benefits. Now, that wasn't true. So how do we know that if the statistics that are being used by the ministers to justify the effectiveness of their reforms are receiving reprimands from the civil servants who produce the statistics?
Well, actually, I mean, that was true. 8,000 people who would have been subject to the benefit cap have moved into work. What isn't yet known or proven is what proportion of that 8,000 moved into work as a result of the benefit cap. So that's the point that was at issue. But it's it's a proven fact that 8,000 of them have moved into work since being contacted by the department. Great deal of work has been done between local authorities and Job Centre Plus to work with those affected by the benefit cap to try and help them into employment before the benefit cap hits them. We feel anecdotally that's had a tremendously positive effect on those individuals, but we can't at this stage prove that 8,000 went into work because of the benefit cap or because of that support. Some of them would have gone into work anyway. What I think that does show, though, and Richard may want to say more in a minute, is just how positive that sort of close working between Job Centre Plus and local authorities with claimants who will be affected by reforms can be in really changing their lives.
So there's no evidence that a benefit cap actually helps to people or incentivise people to get into work. There's 8,000 people went before the cap was introduced. 8,000 people found work without the cap, but we've had a cap in order to get people to find work.
8,000 people who would have been capped have moved into work following interventions from Job Centre Plus and from local authorities working in partnership. That is simply a fact. We can't prove that they moved into work because of the cap, but we believe, and certainly our discussions with them in Job Centre Plus indicate that many of them have engaged positively with employment support because of the impact of the cap. Certainly the cap in financial terms, in arithmetic terms, does incentivise work, because if someone is in full-time work on tax credits, they're not subject to the benefit cap. So that in itself is straightforwardly an incentive to work. Over time, it takes time to fully evaluate and monitor these things. Over time, we'll have a fully rigorous impact assessment evaluation for all of these reform measures, particularly for the benefit cap, but also for the spare room subsidy. But it takes time for data and analysis to build up, and we're simply not at that full stage yet.
Just to add, anecdotally, we have had some really positive feedback from the work that in a number of areas we've done jointly with local authorities, with people going out, local authority and one of my staff, going out locally in areas together to look at what all of the support could be put in place for those that may be affected by benefit cap. And the anecdotal evidence is that has often led to people going to work. But as Pete said, clearly the numbers have to still be run through and ratified.
On a separate issue, employment support allowance and the mechanism for assessing people for that, can you confirm that there is no overlap between assessments for ESA and assessments for what's currently DLA but will soon be PIP?
Bill, or was Jason, are you
in terms of overlap, in terms of the people conducting the assessment?
The assessments themselves, are they distinct and separate assessments? Completely
separate assessments conducted by separate healthcare professionals on different premises.
Okay. So when Citizens Advice Scotland send me a document which contains 5 or 6 examples of where Bureau have been advised of unsuccessful DLA applications on the basis of healthcare professionals who examine someone for an ESA, that's not possible?
That shouldn't be possible.
So if Citizens Advice Scotland can provide the evidence of this, would you look at it?
I'd be happy to look into it, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll open up to colleagues who may want to ask any questions. Jamie?
Thank you very much, Convener. I want to touch on the area of household payments. Can you set out for me, gentlemen, if the DWP has made any assessment of the impact on children of the move to household payments, where previously some payments were made directly to the main carer?
We did conduct an impact assessment and have kept that up to date throughout the period between the sort of white paper around universal credit and the regulations around universal credit. I can't recall whether in detail that gave the impact on children of that. What we have said quite clearly is that there will be a small minority of cases where a single household payment won't be appropriate either from the outset or in time. It's proven that the money is not being used in the most effective way for the benefit of all household members, and in those cases there will be the option of of an alternative payment mechanism of split payments between household members, but that will be very much the exception rather than the rule. The great majority of households do share their money very effectively and should be encouraged to do so.
You said there, Mr. Searle, that some households will be exempt after time because it's been demonstrated that the benefit being provided isn't being utilised in a form that benefits the entire household, but some households may be exempt immediately. What will the circumstances be there? What will be the criteria?
I mean, that's something we're still working through as part of the local services support framework that we're going to enter into with local authorities, local partners. It connects with things like direct payments, monthly payments, and working so that both we, the DWP, but also partners who might be local authorities, might be housing associations, can identify up front people based on a number of criteria who we feel may not be able to cope from the outset. So more generally, say with monthly payments or with direct payments, people with known severe alcohol or drug dependency problems, we wouldn't expect them to be on direct or monthly payments from the outset. What we need to do is to make sure that we've got mechanisms in place with local partners to identify those people before we start that sort of inappropriate payment mechanism, but very much the exception rather than the rule.
I mean, I appreciate you're saying that this is still being worked through, and you mentioned there that there'd be a range of criteria, and you suggested that some of that might be to do with substance abuse issues, and I accept that it's still being thought through, but can you tell us in these early discussions and these ongoing discussions what other criteria might be encompassed?
I mean, it could be, history of severe debt problems or history of severe gambling difficulties, a long record of arrears with rent. Those sorts of issues would be amongst the criteria that we'd use to assess. But it would be very much an individual judgment, individual assessment, rather than categorising people and saying, you fall into category A, you're not capable of looking after your own finances, whereas you fall into category B and you are.
Where you are saying this will be the exception and the rule, will people be able to come forward and say that I want to be exempt from this? Will that qualify them?
That would be one of the factors, but it's not going to be a choice. So if someone says for this reason and that reason I have severe alcohol dependency issues, then we would certainly take that into account. But what people won't be able to do is choose without any other supporting evidence a certain payment mechanism.
One of the underlying features of these reforms is to encourage and foster a sense of independence, is it not?
Yes.
So if a person comes forward and tries to exercise a degree of independence and says they want their money paid in this format, that doesn't qualify?
I mean, I think in the circumstances you're talking about, someone would actually be trying to maintain their own sense of dependence rather than a sense of independence. And I think in those
even when they've self-asserted, even when it's their own choice.
I think so. If there is no strong reason why that person could not cope, I think the view of the government is very much that we should encourage and help people to be able to support themselves and look after themselves, and that it's greatly in their long-term interest to be able to do that. One of the things that keeps people in poverty, keeps people in dependency, is, for example, with monthly payments, that fear that if they move into work, suddenly they'll have to look after their rent payments, they'll have to be able to budget, and that's a big step into the unknown for some people, just as much as actually starting work is in the first place. So that sort of barrier is something that we can help people to address when they're out of work, so that the move into work is less frightening for them.
I mean, I started off this question session by asking about the impact on children, and I appreciate you say you don't have the detail to hand. If you can go back and see if you do have that and provide the committee, I think it would be very helpful. But I mean, what about the circumstances whereby an individual comes forward and says, the reason I don't want to have the household payment, the rest of it, whatever, is because of the impact on my child? Is that not going to be enough of a criteria?
I think someone just simply saying it wouldn't be, but if they've got evidence to show why that would be the case, then certainly we would take that into account. Absolutely.
Having explored the impact on children. I wonder if you could tell me the impact, the quality impact assessment that your organisation undertook. Can you tell me what perhaps that said about the impact of moving to household payments on the independence of women, perhaps?
I certainly know that issue was covered in the impact assessment around this, and that there are a number of payments that will come into universal credit that at the moment might go to the mother as opposed to the father, as well as ones that would go to the father. And by consolidating payments into one single household payment, then in all probability that will mean more payments will go to men, more payments will go to the father than will go to the mother, although not all by any means. And that, in purely kind of mathematical financial terms, that will mean some money won't initially be in the pockets of the mothers, but the great majority of households fully share their income. Only 7%, I think, of cohabiting couples and 2% of married couples don't share their income in some way. So it's quite a rare, unusual circumstance where that presents a major issue.
But has there any issues been identified as to what the likely impact will be in those circumstances? I
can certainly, share the impact assessment that we've been keeping up to date since the publication of the white paper, where that issue is covered. Yes. I
have some questions about secondary earners, but I know I've taken quite a lot of time, so maybe I'll come back to that.
Thanks, Jamie. With Linda then.
Good morning. The really hard end of some of this is, and we've all seen it locally in the work that we do and heard from organisations like Citizens Advice, is people ending up with no money at all. So I would like to just look at some of that. Could you explain to me, first of all, and I read it from, I think it was a letter to Margaret Lynch, from yourself, Richard, answering some of her queries. The civil penalty, can you explain about the civil penalty to me and why it would be that someone would get a £50 penalty?
I think my understanding of the civil penalty is that it's in kind of quite extreme cases where it's not a common thing where people would regularly face that kind of penalty, but it was something brought in within the Welfare Reform Act where if people have deliberately not given the right information, then there is that penalty that can be looked at.
So like people are getting fined for not giving the correct information? If
they've deliberately not given the correct information.
Right, because I see you also said that each case will be considered in its merits. So there's a degree of discretion there that maybe isn't there with other elements of these reforms. So who would make that decision? Because there is concern about people making mistakes, ending up getting penalised.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the figures to hand. My understanding is that this is something that's only come in quite recently and hasn't seen huge numbers of cases so far. But that would be a decision maker, an independent decision maker that would review all the evidence.
These very junior members of staff that can't come and speak to us.
I mean, Jason might want to comment on that.
It would be one of my decision makers would do that, and it's where somebody is overpaid benefit, and then there's a decision made about what the cause of that overpayment was, and generally they fall into three categories. Either it's an official error, we've got it wrong, in which case.
Did you find yourselves £50?
So in that, in those, so sometimes we do get those wrong, and the second would be where there's been a mistake by the claimant, where they've provided information, and that's where the judgment needs to be about whether or not that was deliberate. And then the third category is where people are committing fraud, and we have overpayments generated by people committing fraud. So in those circumstances on the penalties, it's where people have provided incorrect information. There's a judgment to be made about whether or not that was deliberate in order to gain additional benefit.
And that judgment would be made by a decision maker.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that, I mean, is concerning certainly lots of advice agencies and concerning myself, I mean, people are turning up at food banks because they've got absolutely no money. Sanctions. It certainly seems to be quite a tough regime on sanctions that people have been trying to understand, but there have been quite a lot of cases, some of which Citizens Advice have sent to us, and I've seen a couple of cases myself where there's been an inappropriate use of sanctions, where the department has actually got it wrong, and people are ending up going to an awful long time without any money. There have been reports lately of people being so depressed that they have considered taking their own life. We've seen reports of people who have taken their own lives. What is the decision-making process with regard to sanctions?
Shall I start off and then Jason might want to come in? I mean, so for example, if we're talking about job seekers allowance, it's really clear when someone claims job seekers allowance what their expectations are for them to undertake as part of their job search activity, and that's made really clear on a job seekers agreement that sets out exactly all of those requirements. And then during the course of their claim, in their regular reviews with when they come along every fortnight, or with their personal advisor interviews, if the advisor doesn't feel that the person is applying for jobs that they could, according to their agreement that they've signed up to, then it might be that they would be referred to a decision maker, what we call raising a doubt about that person's job search activity, and then that would be passed to an independent decision maker to look at all the evidence. The customer puts in their evidence as well, and then a decision is made whether that does apply for a sanction.
Yeah, I mean, we've got cases here, and I have no reason to doubt the Citizens Advice Bureau, having looked at these very carefully, where people have been able to provide written confirmation that what they're accused of wasn't in fact the case, and that they hadn't missed appointments and stuff, but they still had the sanction imposed and didn't have it lifted. Why would that be?
I mean, I can't talk for the individual cases, but if they provided all the evidence that backed up what they were saying, then I would expect that decision not to be made.
We do have examples where that hasn't been the case, but I wonder if that's back to what you said earlier about decision makers being very junior members of staff, that perhaps there should be some kind of appeal mechanism in place where somebody with a bit more clout who would be able to come and talk to us about things would perhaps be part of that decision making. I've got some other questions, convener, like Jamie, but let others get on.
I'll go to Kevin then.
Thank you, convener. Today we have seen the publication of research by Citizens Advice Scotland, who are featuring very highly here today, round about internet access, where they have done research with 1,200 CAB clients, the report Offline and Left Behind. In that, they have some key findings. 76% of their clients say they would struggle to apply for a benefit online, including 39% who said they could not apply online at all. Only slightly over half have an internet connection at home. 36% of respondents said they never used the internet, and a further 11% said they hardly ever used it. Just a quarter said they would be able to apply for a benefit on their own with no problem. And yet your expectation is that some 80% will have to apply for benefits online. I hope, gentlemen, that you will take cognizance of this CAS report, and I would ask what you're going to do to try and resolve these difficulties.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps if I can respond to that one. I mean, we haven't seen the full report from Citizens Advice. I've only seen their press release this morning. And so I
Full report this
I
morning,
couldn't see it on their
Cornish.
website at 7 o'clock this morning. But what we don't know is who the 1,200 people are in that survey, so we don't know that they are working age benefit recipients. But if you look at the working age benefit recipients, which are the ones we're talking about in universal credit, then 80% of those do have access to the internet. And I think an important point just to make at the moment is right now, in figures released in March, over 50% of people that claim job seekers allowance are doing it online now. with support or without support wherever it's needed. And that's something we're looking to increase as we go into universal credit. And we're working, as Pete mentioned, the local support services framework at ways beyond the support we're already providing. We've got internet access points in job centres. We've been running training sessions in job centres to help improve people's IT skills, to help coach them, to help handhold them onto Universal Job Match, onto claiming job seekers allowance online. All that activity is going on now, and as I say, we're seeing over 50%, and it's rising all the time, of people claiming online for working age customers. So I think what's also important to say is we don't want to leave people behind. It's really important that we don't exclude people in society from the digital age that we do live in now. And we are seeing right across all sorts of public sector and private sector areas that people will have dealings with, that, you know, we are in a digital world. Something like 90% of jobs that are advertised require some kind of IT skills, you know, right from whether it's working a till in a shop or wherever. You know, every job nearly now has some kind of degree of IT skill required. So that's something we're trying to support people in getting ready for that, whether it's to claim benefits or to help with their job search.
If I just build on that, I was in the Orkneys 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in the Orkneys, where one might think that broadband access to the internet was very poor, they're actually achieving over 80% online JSA claims, so extremely high. Now, I'm not saying everywhere all of the time that is possible, but it just does show what can be achieved. I think Richard's point about opportunities is really, really important, that actually, whilst we need to make sure we support people to get online, to use the department's digital services, you know, actually this provides an opportunity to help people become more capable generally, which will help them generally through in social inclusion and in the world of work. So I think it's a very positive opportunity, and we'd like to work with all partners, including the Scottish Government, to further that digital inclusion.
You've given your Orkney example. I'll give the example of Shetland, where I was last summer with another committee of this Parliament, where the broadband service was down for the 2 days that I was there. And it's not just a rural problem. I represent a city centre seat in Aberdeen, and you know, many of my constituents find it very difficult to access high quality broadband. But let me move on, because almost half, 49% of the 1,200 clients that were surveyed here said that they would be completely unable to complete a benefits application online. They said that their main barrier was they had never used a computer before. 16% of those said that their main barrier would be health related, including physical disability or mental health problems. Now, you're saying that you have additional support in your job centres. I would ask how much that additional support is costing you to put in place, and what are we going to do in terms of supporting Citizens Advice and other organisations who are actually having to deal with a lot of this?
I mean, I think just to start with the final point around citizens' advice, in that report today, you know, they've made the point that actually they do support people becoming kind of digital you know, savvy, improving their IT skills. So I think, you know, we're kind of saying very similar things. Of course, there are people that don't have the IT skills, they don't have the confidence, and that's something, you know, we have worked on in the job centres, as I said, through training in the job centres, but also just through one-to-one coaching. So rather than perhaps a traditional advisor interview being done sort of behind a desk, I am seeing some advisors now, when I go into job centres, you know, walking with the customer onto a PC, helping them, sit with them, and actually conducting that interview together, you know, in front of a PC, looking at the jobs that are out there on the internet. So it's something that isn't just about training courses. It's part of kind of changing the service we deliver and changing the culture of how we deliver our services to offer those kind of digital interactions and IT upskilling as part of everything we do every day.
So although Citizens Advice have come up with this findings which says that almost half, 49% of folk will have major difficulties, you still believe that your 80% target of online applications is achievable?
I think if you look on the evidence of what people are doing with job seekers allowance at the moment, where, you know, over half, and as Pete mentioned, in some places it's hitting 80% already, are claiming online, and of course there are 20% perhaps that won't. So we're not saying, you know, in light of the Citizens Advice statement that we would expect everyone to claim online. We think there will be people that may not be able to, and that's okay, and there'll be other channels for them to claim.
At this moment in time, though, job seekers allowance you're coping with that, so you claim at this moment. We have not seen all of the others come into play yet. You've restricted the amount of pilots that you were going to do in universal credit. There are restrictions in other pilots that are going on. Obviously, it seems that some of the previous targets that have been set have maybe turned out to be unachievable. Would I be right in saying that?
No, I don't think that's correct. I mean, I think our, as I said at the outset, what the government's looking to do with these reforms, universal credit being a case in point, is to start gradually to build, make sure.
Why have these pilots been restricted in terms of the areas that were originally said they were going to start in? Why is that restriction taking place?
If you're talking about the Pathfinder, the conclusion was the most sensible way to begin was to start in one office and then expand out to the other 3 offices that were part of the initial Pathfinder phase, and then broaden out nationally from October. That's basically broadly always been the plan, to start small and local with straightforward, newly unemployed claims, to learn about the processes, test the IT, test the claimant experience through that small start, and then to build from there. I mean, on the 80%...
Backtracking and what was originally planned to happen in that regard?
Well, the very initial plan for the Pathfinder was to start in 4 job centres rather than the 1. We've now started in 1 and we'll very quickly expand to the 4. But that's a very small change. The basic principle is the same.
So Citizens Advice reckon that the 80% target is really unachievable. You reckon that is achievable, and you would say that the Citizens Advice findings are not right?
It's an aspiration rather than a target. We aspire to achieve that. I think what we're achieving on Job Seekers Allowance shows it's not an unreasonable aspiration, and we think it's a very important aspiration in terms of giving our claimants' customers the opportunity to build skills that they may not have currently. We recognise they do need support. We'll help organisations, local partners, including the CAB, provide that support to get people to that place. But we think it remains an achievable aspiration, not tomorrow or the day after, but in time.
So you've just said that you'll provide that support. Is that monetary support for these organisations? Are we going to see more money coming from the government to help Citizens Advice Scotland and others who are helping you out in this? Are they going to get the resource required to do that?
When I mentioned the local support services framework, that's something we've been consulting on and working with local partners on. That will come with funding. So the funding would tend to be outcome based, so it would expect sort of results to be achieved. We see local authorities being at the centre of those partnerships, but I would hope that CAB and other third sector providers would also be in there. Very much a part of that local support is around digital inclusion, digital support. So yes, there will be additional funding available.
And have you costed that, and how much additional funding will be available?
That's still work in progress.
Okay, I do have other questions, but like the others, I don't want to hog this convener.
Thanks, Kevin. Alex.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I wanted to go on to the issue of work capability assessments. Now, we've had on the committee our own process where we've invited people to come along and have their say. And the vast majority, if not all of those who have come forward, have had problems with work capability assessments. There seems to be a general problem that, first of all, they're perceived as being a very adversarial process. Do you believe they are meant to be an adversarial process, or should it be something that's carried out in a relationship of equals? Would that be fair?
Do you mean the assessment itself with the healthcare professional? Is that, Bill, one you're best placed to?
Yeah, certainly. Clearly, it's not meant to be in any way adversarial. The whole purpose of the assessment is to look at the individual's health-related issues and the impact on their capability for work, and to gather the evidence in an independent, objective way. Now, it is always going to be difficult, because clearly for a lot of people, firstly, it's distressing. I think we should recognise that anybody who's got to go through any form of assessment which has some financial implication is going to produce anxiety and distress, and I think we recognise that. But obviously for those who then, where the outcome is not as they expect, that inevitably is going to feel, is going to move them into a slightly adversarial situation. But the actual assessment itself and the way it is done is intended to be done in a professional way. It is about gathering evidence, it's about looking at the individual, the impact of the individual's condition on their capability for work. One of the challenges, of course, is to make sure that, and remember we're doing around 100,000 of these assessments every month, is to make sure that they are done in a consistent way to the same standard across the country so that we get consistent outcomes. So that two people with the same condition that has the same impact being seen in different parts of the country with different healthcare professionals will get the same outcome. So there are challenges in the process in making sure that it is clearly independent, that it's objective, and that the assessment is undertaken and the criteria applied consistently. But it is certainly meant to be, and healthcare professionals are trained to ensure that they do it in a way that is designed to be professional and supportive.
There is a question that's been asked a number of times during our discussions with people who have had a bad experience with the system, and that is that there's some confusion over who actually makes the decisions that are informed by this information. Can you tell us if Atos, as the contractor, has any role in the decision-making process, or whether their role is simply to inform a DWP official who makes decisions on individual cases?
That is very much the case. The Atos healthcare professional is there to carry out the independent objective assessment, taking into account the evidence that's available to them, both in terms of any additional evidence that's been provided and the evidence they get from the assessment, to use that to reach a conclusion on capability for work and to be able to justify the conclusion they've reached by demonstrating that it's supported by the evidence that they have. But then to make that recommendation to the department, and it's then for the department's decision maker to consider the evidence that's been presented to them, which is obviously includes the assessment itself, to make sure that the law is being applied correctly, and then to reach a decision. Clearly, the hope is that the system will work in a way that when the healthcare professional reaches their conclusion, it will be sound, it will have taken into account all the available health-related evidence, and that therefore the likelihood that the decision maker's decision will be significantly different from the healthcare professional's recommendation clearly shouldn't happen that often. But the decision maker has the opportunity to consider whether they think the assessment has been done properly, whether it looks to them as though everything that should have been done has been done, that the evidence that has been available has actually been taken into account. And if they're not comfortable, they can refer the case back to the healthcare professional for review for further work.
We, of course, have spoken to a relatively small number of individuals who have had some difficulty within the system. But it's been suggested to us by a number of people that the number of appeals that this process produces and the number of appeals which are successful after this process are higher than might normally be expected. How do you react to that?
I think if we can perhaps put it into context, because there is a view that the predecessor to the work capability assessment, and obviously the WCA was introduced with Employment Support Allowance in 2008. The predecessor assessment, the personal capability assessment, in fact, in the last quarter of 2005, when we were still doing only PCAs, the successful appeal rate there was actually about 49%. So it is, I think it's worth bearing that in mind. The challenge we've got is that by the time something gets to appeal, there are a whole series of parts of the process which may contribute to the ultimate appeal decision. And we've obviously done a lot of work to look at each of these. Clearly, the important thing is that, first of all, the assessment itself is sound, that it is done properly, and that it takes account of any other available medical evidence. It's important that the decision maker then reflects upon that, makes sure that there isn't any evidence that hasn't been taken account of any other evidence that should be gathered, and that the law is applied correctly. It's then important that individuals understand why they have been unsuccessful. And one of the challenges for us is obviously to try and ensure that people don't have to go through the process of appeal, which in itself is stressful, merely because they don't understand why they've been unsuccessful. There's been quite a lot of work making sure that the individual actually understands, that they've got a clear reason why they have not been granted the benefit. Obviously, then there's the opportunity for reconsideration, and as you're aware, that process is in the course of this year going to become mandatory in all cases, that there will be a reconsideration, so that we can be sure that actually the decision, as far as the department is concerned, is sound. And then there's obviously the assessment by the tribunal itself. One of the challenges, of course, is that that may be many, many months after the original decision. And although the tribunal is, in theory, at least looking at whether the decision at the time it was made based on all the evidence available was the right one, clearly, many months on, the situation for the individual may have changed. Conditions progress. The individual has also been living with a period of uncertainty, and that induces anxiety and so on. So the tribunal's decision itself may be influenced by a number of things, and as I think you're probably aware, one of our challenges has been to get good, comprehensive feedback from judges about the reason for overturning a decision, and that has been difficult, but the judges started a pilot last summer where they are at least giving, from a drop-down menu, the main reason why they've overturned a decision. We're obviously learning from that. We clearly need more information, because not just what the main reason is, but whether there are other reasons as well. That certainly showed it was only in a small proportion of cases that they felt it was a result of the healthcare professionals' report. In many cases, it was the result of the oral evidence provided by the claimant on the day. In a small proportion of cases, it was a result of new information which wasn't available at the time the decision was made. So we have to look at all those parts of the process and try and make sure that we get them all right if we're going to be really successful in reducing the number of successful appeals. I think reducing the number of appeals overall is always going to be a challenge, because clearly people, if there is a financial implication, are quite likely to appeal. The challenge is to make sure that people don't go through an appeals process unnecessarily, if we could have avoided that at an earlier stage.
You have touched on the area I wanted to move on to next, but I will go back over it again just for clarity. Okay. The suggestion has been made to us on more than one occasion that the reason for the high number of successful appeals is that information becomes available during the appeals process, which was, for whatever reason, not made available at the initial assessment stage. And it's been suggested that one of the areas of difficulty is the slow or non-existent feedback from GPs. Is there a specific problem there in that information is not being made available at that early stage, which then becomes available during the course of an appeal?
I think the whole issue of medical evidence, further medical evidence, is an important one, and there are a number of aspects to it. Clearly, it's important that the healthcare professional at the outset determines when it's going to be appropriate to seek further medical evidence. Clearly, we don't want to bring the healthcare system to a halt by asking in every case where it's not necessary, but I think it's important that we identify correctly when further medical evidence will actually be important, and I can say more about that if you want. When we do then ask for it, I think it is important that it is as focused as possible so that we get the right information, that we ask it in a way which is as user-friendly for GPs. And although we may take it from evidence from other healthcare professionals, it's a significant proportion of it comes from GPs, so we need to make it as user-friendly for GPs. Clearly, if we've done all of that, we need then to get the information from GPs. And having done all of that, we then need to make sure that we take account of it. There are challenges clearly in getting information back from GPs, and I've spent a bit of time looking with GPs. Indeed, a few days ago, I was looking at practices in Scotland to look at the challenges of further medical evidence, what we're asking, and we're going to be doing a pilot looking at how we can better determine when further medical evidence is going to be helpful. And following that, we will also look at ways of making it easier for GPs to be able to provide that information to us. I know GPs perfectly reasonably feel that it is one of the last significant paper responses that they have to provide, that most other things can now be done electronically, and clearly this lags behind it. But I think there are things that we could do that would actually make it a bit easier. So I think most GPs want to return it. I think from the evidence that you've seen in terms of the return rates, although we don't get it necessarily in the sort of 2-week timescale that we would ideally like, we still get a significant proportion of it, particularly here in Scotland, before the actual assessment takes place. But clearly, we need to try and improve that. And part of that is obviously working with GP colleagues and their representative bodies to see how we can improve it. And we've been working with the BMA, and indeed I'm going to have further discussions with the BMA in Scotland, who have got, I know, particular issues, to try and see how we can improve that.
But insofar as we are the position we're in today, the process works, but only in effect if you take into account the whole process, including the appeals procedure. Is the objective to move the effectiveness of the process back to the assessment and the interpretation of that assessment, rather than have to depend on appeals?
Clearly, what we need to do is to ensure that when the assessment is carried out, any relevant health and medical and health-related evidence that would actually ensure that the recommendation that comes out at the end of that is actually sound, that evidence is available. And that's one of the challenges that we are working on.
We're making progress towards that.
I think we are. To be fair, and I know GPs get a lot of flack often, I think GPs have been very helpful. I do understand some of the problems. Not all GPs will be helpful. Clearly, that's the norm. But I mean, we worked very closely with GPs, for example, when we developed and introduced the fit note, and actually GPs there have been very constructive. I think we haven't been quite as proactive in looking at the interaction of GPs and the benefit system, and we're doing that now. And that was one of the reasons that I was actually visiting some of the deep end group practices.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I just wondered if Jason wanted to add anything about the appeals sort of success rate, just very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, as colleagues were talking to earlier, this is it's significant volumes of business. So every year we make 2.6 million decisions on the back of a work capability assessment, and just over 430,000 of those are contested, with about a third of a million moving through to appeal, and about 95,000 of those are overturned. And I think if we look at decision making overall, per 100 decisions on incapacity benefit reassessment, for example, about 5 out of 100 of those are overturned on appeal, and on ESA it's about 3 out of 100. Where we have a particular problem is where claimants are found fit for work, and that's where you see some of the higher overturn rates. And I think in support of what Bill was just saying, the more we can get claimants to provide all the available evidence that they have from their healthcare professionals, including GPs, the more information my decision makers have got at the point at which they're making the decision, the better. I think we're doing an awful lot of work at the minute to try and reduce the timescale for appeals. We're bringing down our appeals arrears that we had. We had around about 60,000 arrears of appeals in the autumn of last year. We're now down to 5,000. So we've put an awful lot of effort into that over the winter, because it's really important that not just for the, you know, if you like, the administrative process, but obviously for those that are going through the appeal process themselves. You know, if we can get that process down to as short a timescale as possible, not only are we removing some of the stress and anxiety that that causes, but also we're more likely to see, you know, there's less opportunity for additional evidence to emerge through the process. We want the evidence further up front, really, and we want to shorten the timescale that it's taking for appeals, because at the minute it's too long.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a number of colleagues who have indicated they want to come back in with supplementaries, but that would almost be like having a round of questioning again. So I'm not, if you don't mind, I'm going to go to those who haven't yet asked questions before coming back and giving colleagues an opportunity to come back in with other questions. So Ian.
Thanks, Convener. My main question really is to Mr. Searle, but before I do that, I just wanted to check with Mr. Gunyon. Did I understand you to say there in the passing that one of the reasons you believed WCA assessments were sometimes overturned at appeal was because the stress of the appeal itself rendered the person unfit for work by the time the appeal was considered? And I think you did.
I think what I'm saying is that there are a whole range of issues that will determine whether someone's condition has changed by the time many months later they come before a tribunal. And I think there's no doubt that you know, conditions will have progressed. In some cases, even where we expected condition would improve. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with individuals and health conditions, things don't adhere to rigid patterns. So I think that there will be an element of that. But I think also you know, it is a distressing process. If people have been waiting and with, you know, and anxious, clearly that will influence how they are by the time they come to appeal and how they come across. I think we'd all be the same. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily that it's worsened their condition, but I think it is likely to make the whole process when they appear before a tribunal much more distressing, and that distress will come across.
I think you are saying that one of these factors which makes the difference between the initial assessment, which finds the claimant fit for work, and the appeal, which finds them no longer fit for work, that one of the factors is the distress caused by the process itself. That seems pretty deeply dysfunctional.
No, I'm not saying that that actually affects the fitness for work. I'm saying that may influence the view the tribunal take, which is slightly different.
Taking a view on their fitness for work.
I accept that is what they're doing, but I think what I'm saying is that it is possible for someone to appear more incapacitated than may be the case simply by virtue of the fact that it's distressing and it's been a while they have been waiting for it. And that is only one. And I think, you know, that's only one of the things that will influence on the day how somebody seems to a tribunal.
It's only one, but it's one that's a function of the system.
But that is why, of course, we want to reduce the length of time.
Well, I think between appeals, looking at the official record might be quite interesting then to see what was said. But I wanted to follow up something Mr. Searle said in your introduction, which was that after the meeting we had with the Secretary of State, you had been asked to meet with particularly rural local authorities and housing associations. And you said in the course of that introduction that you didn't, these bodies didn't always agree with government policy. I think given the evidence we've heard from them, we'd be surprised if they ever agreed with government policy. But in some respects, that's neither here nor there, because it is for government to decide what the policy is. In a way, what is more serious is a lot of the evidence we have heard from those bodies, both local authorities and housing associations, is that the policy cannot work without the most serious consequences. So, for example, the evidence from housing associations has been that they simply do not have smaller properties to rent. Therefore, it is simply impossible for the under-occupancy change to housing benefit to allow people to move from one property to a more appropriately sized property. They just don't exist. So I suppose my question really is, in this exercise that you've undertaken and the parallel exercise which Mr. Mundell has also undertaken, not how open and friendly was the discussion, but what changes are going to be made which will actually allow these changes to benefits to be operable in any way at all for those local authorities and housing associations? I mean, what changes will come from these discussions?
Well, the government believes that the reforms are deliverable and are being delivered. The process of my talking to local authorities was really to learn about their particular circumstances, particularly in rural areas. It's part of our ongoing monitoring and evaluation. The government has always said that if with any of its reforms there's strong evidence that there are problems with implementation or with the policy, it will reconsider. But at this stage, that's not anything like where we are with these reforms. I mean, in terms of the spare room subsidy, yes, a lot of the local authorities and housing associations I talked to talked about a lack of one-bedroom accommodation. But actually, there are 148,000 one-bedroom properties in the social housing sector in Scotland, 27% of the sector, only marginally smaller as a percentage of the sector than the figure of 31% for GB as a whole. So there are properties there. In 2011-12, the last year for which I have figures, 24,000 new lets for one-bedroom properties in Scotland. So that there are properties there. There are particular, I mean, there aren't necessarily hundreds of properties sitting empty in April, but this policy has been on the books since June 2010. It's been a long time in the arrival, so there's been plenty of time to prepare for that. And one other, if I,
Jeez, oh, for goodness sake.
If I could also add, if I could also add that there are a number of responses that housing associations, local authorities, and individuals can make in response to the spare room subsidy. Downsizing or moving is one of those within the social sector, to the extent that properties are available. They can also take up work in some cases, and that's an option for some people. What we were talking about earlier on around the benefit cap is the sort of approach that we'd very much like to take with local authorities around the spare room subsidy. They can increase their hours if they're already working. They can take in a lodger. Hundreds of thousands of people in Great Britain, including in Scotland, already have lodgers. It is an option for some people. They can use the private sector, smaller in Scotland, but still there are 60,000 private sector one-bedroom properties in Scotland.
Linda, I don't think it's appropriate to talk over.
There is the.
I don't think this is appropriate.
There is
I understand your frustration, Linda, but I think if we keep order, we get the questions, and you'll get an opportunity to ask supplementaries if you want. But I don't think shouting across a witness is helpful.
Thank you, Convener. There is also discretionary housing payments, which were the government quadrupled actually the amount of money that was put into discretionary housing payments to 10 million in Scotland for 13-14, which local authorities can use to support people either on an ongoing basis or on a temporary basis who are affected by spare room subsidy and other measures. And last but not least, some people will choose to make up the shortfall. So a whole range of options. I'm not saying that for everyone affected this is easy, but all of those options are available.
But surely if you have met with, in particular, rural local authorities and housing associations, you must know that those one-bedroom properties, both in the social rented and private sector, are primarily concentrated in urban Scotland and in the Central Belt. And so for a housing association such as those that serve the Highlands and Islands, almost all of those solutions are simply not possible or practical. And you must also know, if you've met with these local authorities, that the increase in funds for discretionary housing payments, even if they themselves increase the money they've received to the maximum that they're allowed to do so, would only allow them to compensate for a fraction of those housing benefit changes. I mean, if you haven't learned that, then surely you can't have been listening to what these bodies have said to you. I come back to my initial question. If through these meetings nothing has changed, then this has just been a cosmetic exercise, hasn't it?
Your point about rural local authorities, and particularly kind of the more remote ones, I think is an important one. I mean, what has certainly been clear from some of the conversations I've had is that there are particular challenges in more remote locations, not necessarily rural, because rural can be 20 miles away from Edinburgh, but more remote. For example, the the outer islands of Orkney, where there are very fragile communities. There are literally, I understand, in the social sector, in some of these islands, no one-bedroom properties. And real challenges in terms of people leaving the islands and the stability of that community. So I recognise, and the government recognises, there are particular issues in some remote locations. I will agree that all the rural local authorities I talked to did emphasise the challenges around the availability of one-bedroom accommodation, but very often that tended to be around what was available today and tomorrow rather than what was physically there. This is not a cosmetic exercise, very much about listening to the real challenges on the ground as part of early monitoring of these policies. And the government ministers, Ian Duncan-Smith, will review evidence as it becomes available, including the findings of my discussions, of David Mundell's discussions with local authorities, with housing associations and with claimants affected.
So you're saying that your recommendation to ministers will be that there has to be some kind of response to the particular challenges which you find in these discussions?
I'll give a full report to my ministers about what I've seen and heard, and they will take a view on the back of that advice and other evidence that emerges over the coming weeks and months.
Okay. I'll come back to Jamie then for another question. Oh, yeah, I think he's right, Annabelle, if you want to come in now. Right.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Just focusing briefly on the last issue. I take it you all are based in Whitehall as your main place of work. Would that be a correct assumption or not?
That is indeed where I am.
You're all based in Whitehall, or
no?
Based here, just down the road.
You're based down the road, and you're Mr. Feeney's in Leeds. And
I work in London, but I live in Scotland.
No, I was just where your main place of work was. It wasn't really to do with any other issue. It's just because, frankly, I think I would have to describe what I've just heard from Mr. Sell on the issue of the bedroom tax, really Alice in Wonderland stuff, Convener, because, as far as I understand, the available one-bedroom socially rented properties are about 16,000 this year. I understand that there will be 105,000 people affected by the bedroom tax. I don't know how you get that to square up. Also, further to a recent question I posed to the Housing Minister in Scotland in the last couple of weeks, and to an answer received in the last week, the UK government's apparent justification of the bedroom tax is to say that, well, it has to deal with the massive rise in housing benefit. But of course, that's not an issue in Scotland, because we found out that housing benefit is actually rising 2.5 times faster in the rest of the UK than in Scotland. So it's not a solution, if it could be a solution for anybody, that fits a problem in Scotland. And, the idea that because it's been on the books since 2010, were we supposed to magic up 100,000 plus houses when we've had a cut in our capital budget of some 25% from the Westminster government? Again, it doesn't add up. And lastly, to suggest to perhaps an older woman living by herself that she should take in a lodger, frankly, I find as a matter of a state intervention really insulting. But I would like to go back to a few questions on the WCA, Convener, if I may, and just picking up on the paper that was helpfully provided by the DWP. I had a few questions. So in the first step, as far as I understand it, the healthcare professional will look at paper that he has or she has, and the DWP go on to state that if the healthcare professional is able to advise on the basis of documentary evidence, and then in parentheses it makes the point that this will sometimes but not always include medical evidence from a GP or other medical profession, the healthcare professional may be able to take a decision such that there does not need to be a face-to-face assessment. And I just wonder, what would be the documentary evidence where there's no medical evidence at that very first stage? How could a decision properly be made without any medical evidence?
Remember that what the healthcare professional has is the ESA 50, which the individual completes. So that's got a lot of information about the individual's conditions and their view of the impact. And we've recently revised that, as you're probably aware, working with many of the disability organisations. Now, it may be that the information in that is actually clear, that somebody particularly who's got quite significant impairments may actually be possible to make the decision. And certainly in cases where we're doing incapacity benefit reassessments, we will already have information. But obviously, that will tend to suggest where it is, we think actually it's probable that with some further evidence, we may be able to provide a face-to-face assessment. So that's where then the healthcare professional will take further medical evidence. In relation to new claims for ESA, that's where it will avoid, so you can place someone in the support group. For incapacity benefit reassessment cases, we also will put people into work-related activity group on the basis of paper evidence, because we have a lot more knowledge about the individual than we obviously do have for new claims.
Well, thank you for that. And could I go on to ask, it's then indicated that the vast majority of reports are completed using a computer system, block capital, well, L, small I, block capital M, block capital A, Lima. I'm not quite sure what that stands for. And the DWP note goes on to say HCPs, healthcare professionals, select the descriptors appropriate for each claimant, and the system then calculates these into a point score. Who selects the descriptors? Who decides what the descriptors are? Because that's a very key part of the process.
Yeah, the descriptors were developed as when the assessment was developed. So these were things that were designed across a range of activities to provide the best proxy to the sort of things that would be relevant in a working situation. It would test out things that were relevant to a working situation, both in terms of physical capabilities and mental and cognitive capabilities. And it's all set out, the different descriptors, and the healthcare professional's role is to gather the evidence so that they can select the right descriptor. And I think it's often, the impression is that actually this is about a sort of tick box assessment. It's not. The healthcare professional has to be able to gather the evidence during the course of the assessment, or indeed from other medical evidence, that will allow them to select for each of those activities the appropriate descriptor. The descriptor has then points attached to it, but it's not, the individual is not, the healthcare professional is not selecting on the basis of points, but on the basis of the descriptor that comes closest to their view about the impact of the individual's condition on that particular activity.
Do you feel comfortable that the descriptors in place are relevant and fit for purpose?
When we developed the work capability assessment, we made very clear at the outset that we knew that this was something that was going to require to be refined over time in the light of experience, and indeed we did relatively soon after the introduction of the WC. We did a review internally. That led us, in working with, again, representation from disability organisations, we made a number of changes, significant changes to the assessment, and those were introduced subsequently. We've then had, obviously, the 3 independent reviews that have been undertaken by Professor Harrington, and again, we've looked at what we've learned from that. Perhaps the most significant ones there in relation to descriptors were his invitations to the charities to look first of all at those at how we treated people with cancer, and as you're aware, we then made significant changes to how we treat people within the WCA who are awaiting treatment or undergoing treatment for cancer, and those changes were introduced at the beginning of this year. Professor Harrington also asked charities to look at their view, because there's been a lot of criticism of the mental function descriptors and indeed how we addressed chronic and fluctuating conditions. And there were 2, the charities produced 2 reports. We looked at those. Our concern was that although they made recommendations, they didn't actually have evidence supporting as to why the current descriptors didn't work or why the new ones would work better. And we felt that in order to change things, if we're going to do it, we need to do it properly. We therefore have established an evidence-based review where we have worked with the charities to develop their suggestions for revised descriptors into a testable form of assessment. And that is going to be compared with the existing assessment. Now, that work is well underway. We have been we have been undertaking assessments with both sets of descriptors, and we're going to have expert panels who will look at the evidence without knowing the outcome, but looking at the evidence that an individual presented and determine what they think capability of work would have been, and then we'll compare that with the two different assessments. We should have a report on that, some initial findings in the summer, and certainly a report by September, and on the basis of that we'll then consider whether to make more significant changes to the assessment itself.
Can I ask then, Convener, we've had evidence from, at least to my mind, 2 witnesses before this committee who have been tested on their ability or otherwise to lift an empty box from one part of a room to another. Can you perhaps explain to the committee why that is a determinant of anything, really, in terms of replicating a useful function in a workplace? One of the witnesses in this respect was a blind man.
I think it's important to remember that, of course, we're looking at all the things that will impact upon an individual's ability to work. So the fact that somebody may be blind, there may be other issues that will also affect their ability to work. And remember that being blind per se doesn't necessarily stop an individual working.
Interrupt, but I mean the point was moving an empty box from one
part
of a room to another. What is that useful to show?
I was going to come on to that. Obviously, what we are trying to do is to use things that will test different aspects of functioning, so whether somebody is able to reach, to stretch. You've picked out one particular bit, so we're looking at a range of movements that will actually test what an individual can do, whether an individual can stretch. There are a whole range of things that we're trying to test out that will show whether somebody can actually undertake a range of work tasks. Now, that clearly, again, you're looking at different types of work. This is about whether somebody's capable for any form of work. So lifting tests out movement at different joints and different muscle groups, rather than testing out strength per se.
But I mean, I would imagine if you were an employer, that it wouldn't perhaps be the moving of empty boxes that would be what you would be seeking to pay somebody for. It might rather be the moving of boxes that had things in them.
Yes, but I think you missed the point. These are proxies for different types of function, and the empty box isn't testing the ability to lift weights. It is actually about the ability to move different joints and muscle groups. And the problem is that the assessment was developed, and it was developed with a whole range of experts, and indeed with disabled people. The assessment is designed to be integrated, so you can't just pick out one particular function, one particular part of the assessment, because actually you're testing out different things in different parts of the assessment, and it's the overall integration of the assessment that's important.
Well, I would say just in conclusion that I feel we're entering a kind of Kafkaesque world, Convener, and having been a member of the House of Commons some years ago and dealing a lot with issues to do with welfare, I have to say that whatever the government, whatever hue the government, be it Labour or now Tory, it just seems we've got the same old problems, the same Kafkaesque world of the DWP, where we talk about the relevance of moving empty boxes. Thank you, Convener.
Convener, could I just, sorry, at the start of those questions, there are a few points about spare room subsidy. If I could, for the record, just come back and comment very briefly on those. Firstly, you talked about 105,000 people affected. Our estimates, DWP's estimates, are that 80,000 people are affected. I'm not quite sure of the basis for the 105. I've heard it quoted, but we'd be interested to understand that more. As I said, 24,000 in the last year for which we've got figures available, 24,000 one-bedroom properties were re-let in the social sector. So not
important point here.
Mr. Earls trying to make his point. Let you come back in and ask questions, but I don't think interrupting someone in the middle of their response is going to help us to move the discussion forward. So you want to carry on, Mr. Sir?
I will be very brief. On the housing benefit rise, the real terms rise, you're right that is the rise is greater in England and Wales than it is in Scotland, but it's still been a 21% real terms increase in housing benefit costs in the 10 years to 2011-12 in Scotland. So still very substantial real term rise. Yeah, so it's as I say, it's faster in England, Wales, but still very substantial in Scotland. I'm not saying to an ageing lady that she should necessarily take in a lodger. What I said is there are a whole range of options available to people affected by this. That is one of those options. It may not be appropriate for everyone, but it is one of the options. And lastly, the UK government has put in £10 million worth of discretionary housing payments that are designed for local authorities to choose based on their priorities who they think need support following the introduction of this measure.
I'll come back round everyone again who'd want to come in with points that have been raised. Jamie.
Thank you. Convener, thought occurs to me, I wonder if all these proxy empty boxes will be utilised for all these people that have to move house under the so-called bedroom tax. But that's not the area I want to explore. I want to return to this issue of assessment, because Mr Gunyon set out very clearly in response to Alec Johnson that DWP decision makers make the decision. It's only a recommendation from Atos, who the DWP have contracted to make the assessment. I've got figures here from Citizens Advice Scotland. You can tell me if these are correct or not. That DWP agreed with 98% of Atos recommendations. Does that sound about right?
No, it's actually slightly.
The average is about 8% that the decision maker takes a different view. There's quite a range within that number, though, so it can be as high as in the sort of early mid-20s. So, and we've got some of that range as well within Scotland. So, but on average, it would be around 8%.
So it's not 98%; it's 92%.
Yeah.
I mean, that still would suggest to me a high correlation between the recommendation and the final decision. Would that not indicate that essentially DWP decision makers are essentially just rubber stamping a decision that's already been made, or is that an unfair position to arrive at?
I think it would be unfair. And the what the decision makers are doing is taking that assessment and wider medical evidence, and we've already talked earlier about the timing of which some of that medical evidence appears, and it may well be that we've got medical evidence that wasn't available to the healthcare professional undertaking the assessment. But in order to take a view across all that available evidence and seek additional evidence where we think it's necessary, where the decision makers feel as if there's an area that needs to be probed further and where we need further clarification. And we undertake that activity and then apply that assessment and all that evidence to the legislation and the law to come with a decision. It's very important, I think, and it's a role that's been significantly reinforced and emphasised by Professor Harrington about the independence of that decision-making, and that decision-making ought to sit with the department and not with those conducting the assessment.
Okay. Perhaps clarify as well, and perhaps reassure the committee that where decision makers have additional medical evidence that wasn't available to the healthcare professional, they are able to go back to the healthcare professional and seek a view on the basis of that medical evidence, because I think there is concern sometimes that our decision makers capable of assessing medical evidence, if they've got new medical evidence that clearly wasn't taken into account, they would go back to the healthcare professional to see whether that evidence actually would then change the recommendation that they had made.
Okay, I want to turn to the mentioned earlier. I had a question about the position of second earners under universal credit, and that's the area I want to explore just now. And Kieran, I want to return to the DWP's own impact assessment on universal credit, and it itself stated, I think at page 22, second earners do not benefit as much from the reduced taper under universal credit. I mean, would that suggest then that the DWP are essentially unconcerned about the impact on second earners, who are more likely to be women?
No, it wouldn't suggest that. Well, it's the primary objective of universal credit in terms of work was to substantially reduce the number of workless households. I don't have the impact assessment in front of me. I think it's 200,000 or 300,000 reduction we foresee across the UK in the number of workless households overall, because the government feels that having someone in the household who works makes an enormous difference to the whole household and to the futures of the children in that household. there's necessarily been a balance in terms of the cost of universal credit between making sure there are strong incentives for someone in the household to earn, and for incentives for people after that first earner to move into employment. That balance has meant that the government hasn't been able to increase disregards to the level it might want to, earnings disregards for second earners, but it certainly is not looking upon second earners moving into employment as a bad thing. Quite the opposite, it would very much favour that. The whole design of universal credit does ensure that, be it for first earners or for second earners, work always pays. So an additional hour is always beneficial under universal credit. Substantial reductions in marginal deduction rates for increased hours.
I mean, Mr. Searle has set out, we've already set out that the changes are designed to encourage independence. Like now you're saying that the reforms are designed to incentivise work, but your own impact assessment, again, and I remind it's emphasise that, is your own impact assessment goes on to say it is possible in some families second earners may choose to reduce or rebalance their hours or leave work. I mean, that hardly strikes me as incentivising work.
The great majority, the net impact of universal credit on earning is to increase hours, a very large increase in net hours. What universal credit does is remove some of the oddities in the current system that creates incentives that actually aren't really about what people want. It's just almost forcing people to be at a particular point in the earnings distribution just because that's what the system dictates. What universal credit allows people to do is to find actually what suits them best in terms of balance between their caring needs and their employment and income needs. So it ensures that second earners benefit from those earnings. In some cases they may choose to work less, but overall it's a strong net positive.
I mean, you talked about the net impact there. I mean, is the net impact more important for the DWP than the effect on individuals?
The overall impact on households is the important thing for the DWP and for ministers. So, as I said, their primary objective was to maximise the number of households where someone is in work, and that was the primary objective in the design of universal credit. I did hear about the announcements yesterday from Nicola Sturgeon, and I'd be interested to know more about exactly what she has in mind in terms of earnings disregards, whether she's thinking of additional earnings disregards for a second earner that are equal to the current proposed levels for first earners. That's something that wasn't clear to me from the announcement yesterday, but I'm sure further details will emerge.
It's good to hear the DWP are learning lessons from the Scottish Government. I mean, just to return to the issue of the impact on second earners who, and I made the point they are more likely to be women, you didn't accept that the premise that the DWP are unconcerned about any impact on them, but nonetheless it's your own impact assessment that does say second earners do not benefit as much from the reduced taper under universal credit. So, you know, what's in it for second earners here? What are you doing to support them?
They don't benefit as much, but that's in a way because first earners benefit so hugely. As I say, you know, I can repeat the same thing several times, but it's primarily about ensuring there is someone in the household who is working. That's enormously important for everyone in the household and for future generations of that family. That's what's led to very strong work incentives for someone, the first person to work. There are still strong work incentives for second earners. It's just they're not quite as strong as for first earners.
Yeah, back to London then, Kevin.
Stay away from bedroom taxes.
Thank you.
Mr. Gunnion, yeah.
I had a feeling it might be coming my way.
You were talking earlier about you know, the assessments, the work capability assessments, and how following the Harrington Review and things have changed. Now these have now been going on since October 2008, so we're 5 years down the line. Do you think you have improved? Not you personally. Do you think the system has improved over that period in terms of work capability assessments?
Yes, and I think if you look at what's happening in terms of the percentage of people in the support group, for example, that has gone up significantly, and indeed the proportion of people found fit for work has gone down. So I think that would indicate that obviously things are improving. And I'm not going to claim that we've got it absolutely right yet. I think we've learned a lot since the introduction. We've learned a lot from Professor Harrington's reviews. We've got an ongoing programme of work. Clearly, the evidence-based review is a fairly significant piece of work, which may or may not lead to further changes. But what we've also done is to build more around the process as well, to try and improve the process. So it isn't just about the assessment itself, but it is also about trying to make it as comfortable an experience as possible. And this is always going to be a difficult experience for people going through that process, but to try and make it a better experience. I think Professor Harrington liked to talk about making it more humane, but I think just making it something that actually feels more comfortable for people. But at the same time, we are continuing to learn from experience and to refine the assessment.
I mean, there have been refinements and exemptions and things, and one of the issues that many of us have come across lately and looking at is where someone has a degenerative condition. Can you tell me, is it true that unless someone's told they're likely to die within 6 months, they are likely to be told they're fit for work?
No, I mean, I think there's obviously something. Would you like to clarify which particular conditions? Because obviously something I suspect underlying it. Yeah.
And of course I'm being anecdotal here because it is not a case of my own, but it's shared experience with colleagues where someone with motor neuron disease, if it is a disease, condition, whatever it was told, that their life expectancy was such that they were still capable of work. But we know that is a terribly degenerative condition.
Yes. And I think
what a stress to put on someone.
Yeah, I think remember that what we actually should be looking at is the impact that a condition has. Now, I mean, motor neuron disease is clearly a particularly distressing condition. For some people in the early stages, actually continuing to work is quite important to them. And clearly it is different for different individuals. We've got people whose life expectancy from diagnosis of motor neuron disease is very short. Other people where it is longer than anticipated. I think the challenge is obviously to firstly identify at the time of the assessment whether it's reasonable for someone at that stage to be able to work on the basis that people with the same impact with motor neuron disease do work, but equally to identify when it's appropriate to review somebody or to make sure that that it is possible to identify quickly when someone's condition has progressed to the point where it's clearly not reasonable any further. So I think we've looked at some of the evidence. Lots of people do go straight into support group with motor neuron disease, but again, we're obviously always interested in actual evidence, not just anecdote, but evidence that we can look at to learn from with particular conditions. Because with conditions like motor neuron disease, things like Parkinson's and so on, it is difficult, and we need to try and ensure that we've got the assessment right, and that we are picking up and establishing the right criteria for it.
So there isn't a 6-month formal point or a 6-month rule of thumb to death?
Not for motor neuron disease. I mean, for terminal illness, obviously, if someone has got a terminal illness and they are within 6 months, then they will automatically be put in the support group. But the challenge, of course, is for many people, and for something like motor neuron disease, that determining that stage may be difficult. Certainly, if somebody with motor neuron disease was considered to be within 6 months, to have only 6 months left to live, they would automatically go in the support group.
So they wouldn't be expected to work?
No.
What
Not
if
the life expectancy
by some fortunate experience managed to go beyond the 6 months?
Clearly, that's one has to be sensible, and obviously they would be reviewed. But
sensible or compassionate, I guess that's the.
Yeah, I think compassionate. I mean, clearly, we have had cases of conditions where there was an expectation that somebody had only 6 months left to live. 3 years later, it is clear that things changed and actually perhaps the diagnosis wasn't as expected. Now, it's entirely reasonable in that circumstance to review things. Where we're talking about a matter of months, obviously,
Would you charge
it's
them
not.
£50 for? Sorry.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Kevin?
I agree with what colleagues have said earlier about Alice in Wonderland or Kafkaesque situations. I've got a number of questions round about clarifications on various things that have been said here today. But first of all, if I could turn to Mr. Gunyon. Some people in this Parliament, including myself, have suggested that certain vulnerable groups should be taken out of the work capability assessment process completely. Has there been any discussions in Whitehall about that issue? Because it seems to me that some folks who have very severe conditions or people with severe learning disabilities or mental health conditions should be taken out of this process altogether, and there should be a recognition that some folk are never going to work. What discussions have there been round about that, please?
Well, I think, in a sense, that situation, I mean, it depends what you mean by taken out of the process. The objective of the paper-based initial review is to identify people whose problems are so severe that it clearly is not appropriate to put them through the process because we've already got the evidence to make a decision, or it is clear that the process would be so distressing that they shouldn't be put through it. So those are the people who would then go into the support group. Now, not everybody goes straight into the support group on a paper-based assessment because quite often it is difficult to be sure, and therefore, but still almost 60% of people go into the support group from paper-based assessment, don't go through a face-to-face assessment at all. So that is designed to try and do the very thing that you are identifying.
Colleagues and myself have cases whereby, you know, common sense would dictate that somebody should not have had to go to assessment, and obviously the paper-based assessment didn't work. If I could turn to assessment itself, Convener, because three of us did have the opportunity to go to a staged assessment at an ATOS facility here in Edinburgh. And the descriptors, as we were watching at the end, as the healthcare professional was putting the descriptors in, you know, if you were looking at the descriptors only, and you were in a faraway place making a decision, the likelihood is that you would have said that that person was fit for work. Sitting in that room, I think you came up with a very different situation. We've probably seen one of the best healthcare professionals at work that day, I would say, and a number of things which he did was to add in various comments which probably helped in terms of ensuring that the decision would have maybe been a little bit better in being taken. However, in a number of those comments, there were obviously some medical terms. Can I ask how many of the decision makers that we have throughout Scotland have any medical training?
I wouldn't have that number. It's some of the, I mean, it's quite an intensive training that the decision makers go through. So on average, it's going to be
training, doctors, nurses.
They would have some terminology, but they're not.
How many?
Not that. Well, I don't have the number. Some may be in an earlier career and may have become civil servants subsequently. It's not an information. It's not a piece of information we will capture, but it's not routine. It's not a condition of being a decision maker on WCA that you should be medically qualified.
Okay, I think it would be very useful for it to have that number, but from what you're saying, it is not the norm, and it would be a very, very small percentage of folk who maybe were in these professions before.
It's not.
So we're talking 1 or 2% tops?
If that, yeah.
If that, okay. So these decision makers are looking at the descriptors and the note-taking, if the healthcare professional has actually written any notes. So they are reliant on the descriptors, which I would say, Convener, would be fair to say that if we had not been in that room, we would have probably said that the person was fit for work. So basically we have got a complete and utter gulf between a person in a room who is dealing with an individual and the person who is finally taking a decision. Do you think that is actually the right way to go about things?
I think, in terms of the additional comments, that's helpful. The more of a rounded view that the decision makers have about the nature of the individual. There's always the opportunity for the decision makers to go back to the healthcare professional that undertook the assessment to ask further clarification about what the terminology means.
When does that happen?
Or on a regular basis. I wouldn't have a number around what the level of interaction. It's not something we will routinely collect.
Convener, I think that these are the kind of things that should be routinely collected, and maybe that would actually resolve some of the difficulties that there are in this process, and maybe would actually give the public out there a little bit more confidence in what they see as a system that's completely and utterly broken. To say that you don't routinely collect those kind of numbers, I find very surprising indeed. Convener, if I could turn to one last point of clarification.
So I just wondered if I might just help a little bit, because I understand the concern. I think one of the things that one of the improvements that was made, particularly following Professor Harrington's reviews, was the requirement for the healthcare professional at the conclusion of the assessment to write, and this is free text, a summary which justifies the conclusion they've reached and the recommendation they're making. And that is actually very important, because firstly it is meant to show that to demonstrate how they have reached the conclusion they have, the evidence on which that is based, and that was designed to ensure that the decision maker had something that was clear. And in fact, if the decision maker didn't understand it, then they should be going back to the healthcare professional. It's also one of the things that we use when we audit the quality of the assessments, because actually what we're looking at there is whether healthcare professionals are actually demonstrating at the different stages that they have gathered, that the selection of the descriptors is based upon evidence that they have gathered, and that their justification at the end reflects, that has got an evidence base, and that it reflects the evidence they've gathered during the assessment and the selection of the different descriptors. So it isn't quite as random as I think you're perhaps suggesting. There is quite a lot of focus in trying to ensure that whatever healthcare professional does the assessment, they actually do it properly and are able at the end of it to justify the conclusion they've reached.
I think, Mr Gunyon, you accused me of being saying this is a little bit random, but in your response there, you have actually shown how random it is, because you said that the decision maker should go back to the healthcare professional if there is anything in that writing at the bottom of that page. What I would have thought would that there would have been guidance or guidelines to say that they should definitely, they must go back to that healthcare professional. But yet we seem to have no figures round about this, and I would be interested if those could be found from afar. Last point, Convener, and it's round about Mr Serrall's comments about one-bedroom properties which are available. I have to say, in terms of what has been said about housing, I've never heard so much claptrap in my life, and it shows quite clearly that many folks have not had experience of housing in this country. And I can understand why Ms Fabiani has been so upset as a former housing professional. But you said, Mr Serrall, that last year there were 24,000 one-bedroom properties which came up for rent in the social rented housing sector in Scotland. Can I ask you how many of those 24,000 were either sheltered, very sheltered, or amenity housing?
In 2011-12, I don't have that figure.
I think that, again, you need to go back and do your homework, because I would imagine that a large amount of that 24,000 one-bedroom houses in the socially rented sector in Scotland would have been sheltered, very sheltered, or amenity housing for lets to specific groups.
A proportion certainly would have been, but I suspect a small minority.
I would imagine if you go and actually do your homework, you will find that it is probably a very large proportion of that 24,000. It may be interesting to get that number, Convener.
It's worth exploring just exactly what the proportions are in relation to that. We're starting to come up against the clock, so just a couple of questions I would like to ask for clarity to conclude. Mr Gunyon, you've continuously referred throughout this morning when we've been talking about the assessment process to we have looked at and we have concluded and we have established, etc. When you say we, do you mean the Department of Work and Pensions, or do you mean the Department of Work and Pensions with its agency ATOS? How involved are ATOS as we in this process?
By we, I meant the department. Clearly, we will take information. We monitor. I'm responsible for overseeing the quality of ATOS assessments, for example. But by we, I meant the department. It is the department, not our contractor, who decides policy. Clearly, we use evidence that's gathered during the course of assessments, but we work very closely with a whole range of disability organisations. Indeed, in the evidence-based review, we've worked extremely closely in helping to develop the alternative version of the assessment for testing. So I did very clearly mean by the department, and in terms of the assessment, thinking about my own role in terms of leading some of that work.
Now that's useful for clarification, but in your clarification you used a phrase which has become common currency, which is ATOS assessments. The ATOS assessments aren't actually ATOS assessments, are they?
Indeed, they are not. In spite of all the attempts to try and encourage other people not to refer to them that way, it is very easy to fall into trap oneself, as I clearly have done. Yeah. Obviously, it is the work capability assessment, and it is obviously the department's policy, and it is the department's assessment. It is executed by our current medical services contractor.
I'm not quite sure whether it would be yourself or Mr Feeney who would answer this question, but when we did go out to the ATOS Assessment Centre, they went to great lengths to assure us that they were not the organisation which arrived at the recommendations or concluded the points allocation. And yet when witnesses have come before the committee, they have said that in the written documentation from the DWP when an assessment is or a decision is made, it refers to the number of points allocated by ATOS, and in some cases they have said ATOS have allocated no points but the decision maker has increased that to X, Y or Z. But ATOS have said they don't allocate points. They went to great lengths to assure us that it was not they who allocated points or made recommendations.
It's a system. By using the descriptors that Bill's talked about at some length this morning, when they select the descriptors that are applicable to the individual, the system itself generates and calculates that through to a point system. The decision maker has the opportunity to look at a wider range of evidence and decide to adjust that points total. So they don't. And Bill might want to come in. The healthcare professional doesn't score it in terms of a points mechanism. They select the descriptors. The system that generates those descriptors and that they select, that generates the points.
That's the system. So it's a computer which allocates the points, not a healthcare professional who looks at an individual and decides whether that person is entitled to X amount of points.
Well, they select the descriptors that are applicable to that case, and that generates the point system.
So it's a computer-generated points allocation system.
And then the decision maker has the opportunity then to adjust that.
Okay.
To be clear, each descriptor has points allocated to it. Now, that's not. It's not presented in that way to the healthcare professional, but there's not something random that happens in the system. The descriptors are all set out, and they're set out in regulations as to which descriptor attracts what number of points.
I'm also aware of the sort of axiom that hard cases make bad laws, but just to give you an anecdote, because we talked earlier, and a lot of the discussion, in fact almost all of the discussion that this committee's had in relation to the assessment process has been in relation to it being stressful and adversarial, and again today those sort of phrases were used when it was being discussed, and you have made it clear that you always want to be professional and supportive throughout this process, and I take that at face value. But I was recently, and again this is anecdotal, but I was recently contacted by a family whose sister had gone through the assessment process and had the decision had been for her to be removed from her benefits. She's 57 years of age. She has never worked in her life because of mental incapacity. She didn't go to a mainstream school when she was of school age. So at no point in this woman's life has she ever been anything less than assessed as being mentally incapable. The family discovered that she had been living for over a week without any food because her benefits had been taken away from her. And when they asked why it had been the case that this had happened, she said that she had not understood what had happened, that she didn't know that there had been any assessment made, that she was not aware of how a decision had been made to remove her benefits. So I checked with ATOS. Now, ATOS were able to tell me precisely when her assessment started, precisely when it finished, and how long it took for the assessor to compile the final report and submit it. That woman didn't realise that she had gone through an assessment process. So incapable was she of understanding it. And yet the conclusion was that she was fit for work, something that she'd never managed to do in her 57 years on this planet. Surely there's something wrong with a system that can leave someone destitute, incapable of understanding what they've undertaken, what they've gone through, and to leave the family feeling that she was tricked out of her benefits. Would anyone like to respond to how we have a system that operates like that?
Obviously, Convener, it would be appropriate for me to comment on a particular case with only part of the story, but I agree that that, as you've presented it, clearly does sound concerning. As a healthcare professional myself, clearly I am concerned. And obviously, we need to learn, if we don't get it right, we need to learn from that. We need to look at why, on any occasion, if we fail to get it right, we didn't, and make sure that we adjust the system accordingly. That is about the whole process of working towards improving something to get it to the point where it is as good as it possibly can be. And that's an aspiration we've had since we developed the assessment, and we continue to have. But obviously, that sounds not the sort of thing that should have happened, but clearly I can't comment without obviously all the details of the case.
I totally appreciate that, but you were the person who was telling us that you wanted the system to be professional and supportive.
Indeed.
Indeed. And that's the type of experience that not just this committee, but every individual elected representative that I talk to encounters on a far, far too regular basis. And when that's happening, you must be able to convince us that you're aware of those concerns and that your assessments and that your appraisals of the system are taking account of these types of difficulties. Now, that woman's now being supported through an appeal, and time will tell whether that appeal is
and certainly where detailed cases
do
come to my attention, we do look into them very carefully.
Okay, and just one other thing for clarification. When PIP assessments are carried out, they're going to be undertaken by Salus stroke NHS Lanarkshire on behalf of the DWP. Salus have made it clear that they, in talking to the DWP and ATOS, had approval from the Scottish Government in terms of the contract. But can you confirm whether the DWP officials spoke to Scottish Government officials prior to this contract being awarded?
I don't think we know the answer to that, but we can certainly find out and come back to the committee.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for that. The normal practice is we will review the evidence this morning. If there are any outstanding questions or any further information that we would possibly require, that we'll correspond with you, if that's okay, and look forward to you providing us with responses to those questions. And obviously, if there's anything that you feel we didn't cover this morning that you would like to input to our deliberations, please feel free to send those the data or information to us, and we'll welcome that. Okay, but thanks very much to you all this morning for coming in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll suspend for a few minutes before we go to our next item. The second item on our agenda today is consideration of the draft annual report for the parliamentary year 11th of May 2012 to the 10th of May 2013. The draft, or the annual report, is a standardised format, a set number of words, and it's just supposed to be an accurate account of the issues that we've looked at. So unless someone can highlight any omissions or factual inaccuracies, are we content? Does anyone have any comments, Ian?
I wouldn't hesitate to break just nodding it through, but in paragraph 23, quite rightly, I think there's an acknowledgement of the concern the committee's had about the unwillingness of Whitehall ministers to give evidence. And we had again this morning the issue of the non-availability of ATOS and decision makers to give evidence as well. And I just wondered if it was worth registering that in the report too.
Used up all 1,500 words, or can we fit stuff in it?
You take that executive decision.
Jamie?
It could be just that there was one thing that could be usefully added, unless I've missed it elsewhere, in the section where we talked about the commission research from Sheffield Hallam University. I wondered at the end if we should just point out that we had a debate in Parliament on that topic.
If they're happy with
and the date.
Yeah. Okay. So other than those two minor changes, we happy with the report?
Congratulations to Clark.
Okay. And that concludes our meeting this morning, and thanks everyone.